Hello and welcome to my 20th video lesson in using Blender 2.6. This is going to be a two-part video in which I'll cover cloth simulation in Blender. So in this video we're going to talk about the basics of cloth simulation, how to simulate cloth so that it collides with other objects and folds and wrinkles and is affected by gravity. And I'll talk about a few more settings. And then in the next video, part 21 of my Blender series, I'll talk about some more fancy things like making, well, we'll talk about that later. So let's get started. Now when you're modeling or you want cloth in Blender, you actually have to model it. So you have to model the object that you want to have act as cloth. In this case, I'm going to make a plane. So I'll go add mesh plane. In fact, I'll turn on my screencast, turn on my add-ons and 3D view and screencast keys, just so you guys can see what keys I'm pressing. And I'm going to display an icon and group them together. So over here you can see what keys I'm pressing. I made a flat plane, and now I'm going to add a UV sphere. So I'll add mesh UV sphere. Now I got some questions about this in the comments. Once you add an object, you get this area down here in your tool shelf, which of course you can press T or T to hide or show. And this area is only available to you to change the geometry of that primitive simple object as soon as you add it. As soon as you move the object or move any other object, that area goes away. So get it into the habit of changing your number of segments and rings, etc., depending on object that you have, as soon as you add it. So I have a collision object, which is going to be the UV sphere, which this piece of cloth is going to rest over. I want to make this bigger, so I'll press S, and then I'll make it 5 times bigger. So I'll press 5, and I'll press Enter. I'm going to move that cloth up, and now to make this plane, or this plane act like cloth, we have to make it have more detail. Right now, if I go into Edit mode by pressing Tab, it only has 4 sides, and it only has 4 vertexes or vertices, and it only has 1 face. Obviously, if we want the material to, or the cloth to fold, we need to have more vertices and edges and faces so that it can actually do those things, fold and wrinkle and move, etc. So I'm going to press W in edit mode. That brings it to the specials menu, and I'm going to select Subdivide. And over here in my tool shelf, I'm going to slide the number of cuts up to the maximum, which is 10. That isn't quite enough. I've got a 10 by 10 plane right now. So I'm going to go W again and subdivide again. And I'm going to make 2 cuts through each one of those 10 by 10. So now we have a 30 by 30 plane. So I've got 900 faces on this plane. It sounds like a lot, but actually it could be higher if we want really realistic cloth. So I'll go ahead back to object mode by pressing Tab. And now we're going to make this plane with 900 faces act like cloth. So it's going to be affected by gravity, and it's going to drape over that UV sphere. So over here in my properties window, if we go over to the last tab, which is the physics tab, we can enable different kinds of physics on whatever object that we have selected. So I'm going to click on cloth. There we go. And it gives me options for cloth. It's now made this object into a cloth object, or it's applied, it has cloth physics applied to it. The first thing we'll talk about is cloth presets. You can make this piece of cloth act like different kinds of cloth. They've only got a few presets here. They've got cotton, denim, leather, and rubber, and silk. And if you choose one of these, you'll see these settings under the cloth heading, this heading right here, change. So obviously the mass of these will change depending on which you select. So I'm going to select cotton, and so cotton has a mass of 0.3. It's got a structural stiffness of 15. I'm not really sure what these values mean in the real world, but these are just Blender kind of numbers. And it's got a bending stiffness or a wrinkle coefficient of 0.5. If I change the cotton preset to, let's say, rubber, you'll see those numbers change quite drastically. Rubber now has a mass of 3, a structural stiffness of 15, and a bending or a wrinkle coefficient of 25. I'm going to turn it to silk, and you'll see that those numbers probably go down a whole lot. So obviously silk is now doesn't have a bending or wrinkle coefficient of 25 like rubber did. It's 0.05, so it can bend a lot more than rubber can. because it's much thinner usually, even though it's not thinner or it's not thicker in the 3D view window, it acts like it's thicker. So these settings will change. You can make your own too by making your own, and this will say custom if you change any of these values to anything other than what the preset gives it. Okay, so to simulate cloth, you just have to press play on your timeline. If you don't have a timeline, you can split your window, of course, and change the window type to a timeline. But I have a timeline already, so I'm going to collapse that window back or merge these two windows if my computer lets me. There we go. And to simulate, we just press play. It's a keyboard shortcut for play. It is Alt-A. So I'm going to press Alt-A, and we'll see it happen. Okay, the cloth just fell through, and that illustrates the point that for any object in your scene to interact with the cloth, it needs to have collision physics applied to it. So it needs to be recognized by Blender as a collision object. So we're going to have it selected, and I'm going to, in my physics tab, press collision. And now it will be considered a collision object. So let's zoom out again, and let's press Alt-A. And as you can see, the cloth is draping and simulating draping over the UV sphere. We're just kind of going to let it settle, maybe to about 120 frames. And then I'll press escape. There we go. Okay. Now, because I had the UV sphere selected, you didn't get to see one important thing. I'm going to select the plane, the cloth plane. And you'll notice that down here on your timeline, as it was playing, now we didn't get to see it because I had the UV sphere selected, you got this blue line at the bottom of the timeline being created as the cloth was simulated. And this blue line represents the cache, or the memory, or the stored information about how the cloth moved. And it displays that we have about 120 or a little bit past 120 frames of that data stored. Now, this is one of the most frustrating things about simulating cloth in Blender, is that sometimes this area acts weird. If you want to play through this, let's say that you want to scrub through your timeline, so drag your playhead through your timeline. Sometimes this cache will erase and start trying to write again. It'll try to simulate it all over again. So let's see what happens. So I'm able this time, it acts differently every time, it just acts kind of weird. To kind of run through it, I can drag through and see what it's doing. As you can see, it's folding quite nicely over the UV sphere, which is great. We are getting, I think, no, it's doing a pretty good job actually, simulating. One thing about this timeline, or the cache, is that if you drag past the end of the simulated area and then drag back, what happens almost all of the time is the cache tries to refresh, or it tries to resimulate. So let's see what happens. I'm going to drag it past that point, and if I go too far, it'll actually try to simulate the frames that it sees that I'm staying on for a little while. So you'll see that it simulated all the way from 0 to 120 something, and then it simulated from 130 something to 140 something with a little gap in the middle. That's because I went too fast. You don't want gaps in your simulation, so that's not really a good thing. But you'll see that as I drag backwards, it'll actually erase that cache from before, which could be really annoying. And that happened because I went past the edge of where it had a solid block of simulation. Now this area does act finicky, and it was a great cause of frustration to me. But I do have a solution. You'll also notice that if I scrub through without a simulation, or after I've erased a simulation, and if my computer lets me, if I go too fast, you'll just kind of get a really bad simulation, because it just kind of simulated the frames that I stayed on for long enough, or it tried to catch up with me. So the cloth actually fell through or broke through the UV sphere, which isn't good. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. I'll just press the back to the beginning button on my timeline, and I'm going to press Alt-A to, oops, I need to actually, see, it actually acts kind of weird. I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning and press Alt-A. And now it should flow nicely. You will notice one thing that's happening that we don't like in this cloth simulation, is that the cloth is going through itself. And that's because we've enabled cloth collision on the collision object, which is the UV sphere. I'm going to press escape because we're past 120 and it's pretty much settled. but we haven't enabled self-collision. So in your properties window, if you go down to the cloth collision area and you expand it out by clicking the little arrow, you'll see that the cloth collision is enabled with that check mark. Of course, you can disable it, but why would you want to do that? And the quality of the collision is set to 2 with silk. It changes depending on what preset you have, or if you change it to a custom value. And that value 2 means that it calculates where the cloth should be, and if it's colliding with anything else, 2 times per frame. So it's not just calculating where the cloth should be at the frame rate of your Blender file or your animation, which by default is 24. It's calculating it actually 48 times per second, that if it's hitting anything else or if it's falling. And we can change that, but of course that'll slow down our simulation. You'll notice that when we simulate the cloth falling and colliding, it doesn't go at the same speed as your movie because it has to do a lot of work. So if I change that to more like 5, the collisions will be more accurate and more reliable, but it'll slow down my simulation. But that's only when it's doing the actual hard work. If I check self-collision, if my computer will let me, that now will stop the cloth from going through itself. Again, we can change the quality. Because they set this value at a lower value than the quality of the cloth collision, I'm assuming that it does a better job of it, or it's just less, they consider it less important than colliding with the collision objects themselves. So I'm going to change that to maybe 3 and press enter. And now I'm going to re-simulate. So I'll press Alt-A, and it will simulate. You'll see the frame rate value, the FPS, up at the top. So the more of these you turn up, or the more of these you change, you're going to affect your frames per second in your simulation. Of course, that won't affect the playback rate once you play back or render, of course, your movie. And this is taking a little bit longer. Now, it must be noted that because we had a 30 by 30 plane for our cloth, it's not going to wrinkle exactly properly. Where these wrinkles are, you will get some weird kind of artifacts when you make this a smooth material, and that's just because the resolution of the cloth was lower than it should have been. In 3D Studio Max, which I learned before Blender, which is a 3D modeling and animating program, you could actually change the mesh topology to, with a modifier called tessellate, which isn't in Blender yet, unfortunately, as far as I know. And tessellate made all the squares in a mesh kind of random triangles, which made cloth work a lot better. But that isn't in Blender yet. So let's bake that simulation. It looked pretty good to me. So what baking is it's located under the cloth cache section. And basically baking will take your cache, or it'll make a new simulation, depending on which one you want, and it'll make it kind of permanent. Not permanent forever, you can always go back and change it if you see something that you don't like or you want to redo it, but baking, in other words, makes the cloth movement permanent, which is good. It also solves you frustration with this strangely behaving timeline with the cache at the bottom. So with the cloth selected, I've got a simulation to about frame 141 approximately. I'm going to press current cache to bake, and this is going to take this cache and it'll make it kind of permanent on the cloth simulation. So I'm going to press current cache to bake, and you'll notice that that blue line turned to a darker blue, or a darker purpley blue. And that means that I am now free to scrub through it, and I'm not scared that it will mess up by scrubbing through, because I've got it baked. If I want to free that bake, if I want to undo that bake so I can redo the simulation, I can just press free bake. Okay, now that we have that simulated, we can start making this cloth look a little bit better, if my computer will let me. I'm going to go over here to my tool shelf, and I'm going to press shading smooth to make it smooth. And those are those artifacts that I was talking about. It's got, that's obviously where one of the squares is, one of the faces is. And you'll see that because it wants to fold kind of diagonally through a bunch of those squares, it's not doing the best job. And the only way to fix this is either to have, or start with, a higher resolution mesh, or to use subdivision surface modifier, or the subsurf modifier. So if I go over to the modifiers tab, and I'm going to add a new modifier, you'll notice that when you add cloth simulation to an object, in other words, the cloth, in the physics tab, it'll add a cloth modifier to that object. So over here, there isn't really any options for this except for apply, which you don't want to do unless you want to make your cloth still. Is that I added a cloth modifier, and now I can add a subsurf modifier, or a subdivision surface modifier, and it'll get added to this kind of stack of modifiers. That's a common term in all 3D programs, your modifier stack. And your modifier stack just basically means all the modifiers that you've applied to an object, but it also implies what order that you've applied them to. And this is important because we've applied subsurf after the cloth modifier, so we simulated the cloth and then we applied subsurf. So the subsurf only smooths down the result of the cloth simulation. When you add subsurf, you actually get a whole lot more vertices and edges, but those are only being applied after the cloth was simulated, so it doesn't make the smoothing better in terms of the cloth simulation. We're doing it after the fact. If we turn these numbers up high enough, you got to be careful with your computer. If you turn these up too high, you will crash your computer. In fact, I might do a save right now. I'm going to call this cloth, not cloth, but cloth sim underscore 01, and I'll save this Blender file. If I turn these up to probably about 3 and 3 in my case, the cloth will look pretty darn good. If I had applied the subsurf modifier before I had enabled cloth physics, it would have taken the subsurf vertices, so every time you add an iteration or a subdivision in subsurf, it adds twice, actually 4 times as many faces for every face that you have. So adding subsurf before cloth will slow down your simulation a lot, but it'll make your cloth look even better without having to add subsurf after. So you can kind of try it both ways. You can add subsurf before you add the cloth and simulate the cloth, or add it after. It's up to you and how accurate that you need your cloth to be. So I've got subsurf applied, and it looks pretty darn good. Let's just play it back really quick. I pressed Alt-A, of course, to play back. It's playing at 12 frames per second, which is half the speed that it would be in real life if I rendered it. And that looks pretty good. Oops, it's trying to simulate even more. So even though it is baked, it will try to keep on simulating it. But of course it won't mess up the previous frames. Now this cloth is really, really thin. It is silk via my preset, but we want to give it a little bit of depth. And so this comes back to our modifier stack. We are going to be using the modifier called solidify to make our cloth have some depth to it. But right now we have the subsurf modifier turned on. And so if we add the solidify modifier, which adds thickness, it adds it after the subsurf modifier. And the kind of common thought here is that in your modifier stack, you want to add subsurf last most of the time, especially if you're doing things like solidify, because now what solidify does is it basically does an extrusion of all the faces in your mesh. And so if you add solidify after subsurf, it has to do more work. If you did solidify before subsurf, it would have to extrude far fewer faces if you did it before subsurf rather than after subsurf. You can change the order of your modifier stack, but be very careful that you leave cloth at the bottom if you didn't apply subsurf first. So I'm going to press one of these up and down arrows, and these can change the order of the modifiers in your stack, and that'll actually affect how they look or how it'll behave or perform. So if I press this up arrow on the solidify modifier, it'll move up 1 spot, so it'll be above subsurf, and that actually changed how it looked. So that does actually matter because the subsurf actually smoothed out the thickness that I added with solidify. In the solidify modifier, I can make my cloth thinner or thicker, so I can change the thickness value. Of course, you don't want to go too thick, otherwise it'll just look kind of ridiculous, and it'll go through itself. You'll notice that even though I had cloth collision, but because we added the thickness modifier afterwards, the cloth collision is still being, well, still looks like they're colliding, or they are colliding, because I've added some thickness to it. So you can make the thickness go inwards or outwards, so you can have the cloth thickness go towards the UV sphere or away from it, depending on what you like. You can also offset it, so you can actually make the cloth a little bit bigger in total. So if you have any parts where your UV sphere is poking through, or your collision object is poking through your cloth, you can use the offset tool to kind of move your cloth farther away from that collision object, assuming that you just have one collision object on one side of the cloth. So that looks pretty good. I want to talk about one more thing. In my cloth options, I'm not going to actually change this, but maybe what I'll do is I will free the bake. Whoopsie. I will excuse me, free that bake to show you a few more of the options without actually changing them, because I like this simulation. You can change the cloth collision properties. So if you are noticing things sticking through your cloth, like if you drape this cloth over a cube, you'd probably see the corners of the cube poking through the cloth. You can change the distance in which it counts a collision, and the force that the cloth is repelled away from the collision object, and that's down here, and the repulsion distance. So the minimum distance, it starts counting cloth collision. So you can play with these values. They'll just affect how far away from the object your mesh or your cloth rests. If you change distance from 0.015, which is a very small number, to 1, then your cloth will drape far away from that object, or in this case, our sphere. But I'm not going to show you that in this video. I might talk about that in my next video. In my next video, I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to make a shower curtain and have it animate opening and closing. And I'll talk about cloth for characters, or clothing for characters as well. Until then, I will see you later. Bye-bye.